Marry my son if you dare to dance this waltz better than my wife. Richard Whitmore's thunderous voice sliced through the glittering ballroom, his champagne glass raised like a weapon, his eyes burning with cruel amusement. The laughter of Manhattan's elite followed instantly, rippling across the marble floor as though cruelty itself was the evening's entertainment. At the center of it all stood Elena Rivers, a woman in a simple uniform, still kneeling as she gathered shards of crystal that had slipped from her trembling hands moments before. The humiliation was supposed to break her, to remind her that she did not belong among chandeliers and velvet gowns. But something in her steady gaze unsettled the room. Her silence was not weakness. It was a storm waiting to break. Andrew Whitmore, Richard's only son, flushed with shame and leaned closer to whisper, "Father, please, this is madness." But Richard only smirked, drunk on his own arrogance and the whiskey that emboldened his tongue. He wanted a spectacle, and Elena was to be a sacrifice. Around them, guests clutched their pearls, fanned themselves, or chuckled with the gleeful cruelty of those who had never been tested by life. To them, Elena was invisible, a servant who had no right to stand in defiance. Yet when she slowly rose, her eyes never leaving Richard's, a strange silence fell. Her voice, calm and clear, cut the tension sharper than any blade. "I accept." The orchestra faltered, the crowd gasped, and for a heartbeat even Richard seemed to doubt the monster he had unleashed. What kind of woman accepts humiliation as a challenge? What secret could lie behind her poised courage? Tell me, if you were standing in that ballroom, would you have laughed with the crowd or stood by her side? The ballroom seemed to hold its breath as Elena's words lingered in the air, sharp and unshakable. For a long moment no one moved, the chandeliers flickering like nervous candles above the crowd. Then laughter erupted, cruel and mocking, as if the very idea of a cleaning woman daring to stand up to the mighty Richard Whitmore was the most ridiculous jest of the century. But Elena stood unmoved, her apron still dusted with crystal fragments, her hands raw from work, her gaze steady as though she had waited years for this moment. Richard's smirk widened as he strutted into the center of the floor, soaking in the attention like a king demanding obedience. "You see," he crowed to the crowd, "even she believes this farce can amuse us. Play the music. Let's give her a chance to humiliate herself." The orchestra hesitated, their bows hovering uncertainly, but the pressure of 200 expectant eyes forced them into compliance. A few women hid their smirks behind jeweled fans, whispering to one another about how delicious the scandal would be when the servant stumbled and fell. Andrew, however, could not bring himself to laugh. His father's cruelty struck him like acid. He wanted to protest, to shield the woman who had done nothing but her job, but Richard's glare froze him in place. For all his life, Andrew had known this look, the warning of a man who crushed opposition without hesitation. Elena's heart beat fast, yet her expression betrayed none of it. She had known ridicule before, the sting of voices that doubted, the weight of eyes that judged her skin, her place, her worth. But she had also known applause that thundered across theaters, flowers falling at her feet, critics writing her name among legends. 15 years ago, that life had been stolen, her body broken, her name erased by cruel chance. Now fate had placed her in the center of this room, not as a guest, but as prey. And yet she felt no fear, only the simmering calm of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Richard's wife, Margaret, finally stepped forward, her elegant gown sweeping behind her like a queen descending upon a servant. She looked Elena up and down with disdain so sharp it could cut glass. "Darling," she said to her husband with a venomous smile, "do you really expect me to lower myself to this spectacle?" "Of course," Richard boomed, delighted. "You won the waltz trophy at the club last year. Surely this employee cannot last a single bar against you." The laughter rolled again, but a few faces in the crowd began to shift, troubled by the cruelty on display. Elena caught those uncertain glances, small cracks in the wall of arrogance surrounding the Whitmores. Her voice, calm yet resolute, carried across the hall. "Mr. Whitmore, I will not only dance, I will dance better than your wife. And when I do, you will keep your word. A man like you does not break promises, does he?" The challenge hit Richard like a slap, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across his features. Then came the roar of his laughter, loud and bitter. "Oh, you've got fire. I'll grant you that. Very well. If you want to embarrass yourself in front of all of Manhattan, so be it." He turned to the guests. "Place your bets, ladies and gentlemen. $1,000 for anyone foolish enough to wager on the Maid." Coins clinked, bills exchanged hands, and the cruelty thickened like smoke. Yet in the shadows, Elena caught the steady eyes of Samuel Hayes, the head of security, watching her with something no one else had: recognition. His lips barely moved as he whispered, too soft for anyone but her to hear, "I know who you are." Elena's breath caught when she heard Samuel's whisper. For years, she had lived in silence, hiding behind ordinary jobs in the anonymity of gray uniforms. But in an instant, she knew the fragile mask of obscurity was about to shatter. Samuel Hayes, a man with weathered eyes, in the quiet bearing of someone who had seen too much, was looking at her not as a servant, but as someone remembered, someone significant. "I saw you," he murmured, pretending to adjust his radio. "National Theater. 15 years ago. Elena Rivers, the star they called untouchable." His words slipped into her heart like a forgotten melody, stirring a pain she had kept buried. She remembered the night vividly, the brilliance of the stage lights, the thunder of applause, the critics comparing her to the immortals of ballet. She had danced as though gravity had surrendered to her will. Then came the night of the accident, headlights slicing through rain, steel twisting, glass shattering, her body broken beyond recognition. Doctors had told her she would be fortunate to walk again, let alone dance. When she finally awoke from the coma, the world had already moved on, her name relegated to tragic whispers. She had disappeared, not from choice but from necessity, piecing together a life from scraps of work, while her soul still ached for the stage. And now, here, in this glittering hall of arrogance, her secret had been uncovered. Samuel's recognition was both a lifeline and a burden. She gave the faintest nod, silently pleading for his discretion, but Samuel's gaze carried something steady and unyielding, as if to say, "The truth has a way of rising." Meanwhile, Richard basked in the chorus of cruel laughter, oblivious to the storm he had unleashed. He strutted about collecting bets, his arrogance swelling, but Elena no longer saw him. She saw instead the ghosts of her past, the standing ovations, the tears of strangers, moved by her artistry, the sense of flight that had once defined her existence. Each memory sharpened her resolve. Across the floor, Margaret performed a few theatrical stretches, her silk gown shimmering under the chandeliers, as if mocking Elena's plain uniform. The crowd applauded her even before she had danced, their loyalty automatic, their judgment predictable. Yet Elena felt none of the jealousy or fear they expected. Instead, she felt a strange clarity, as if the broken pieces of her past were aligning into a single truth. The humiliation Richard intended was no longer a threat. It was an opportunity, not to reclaim fame, but to reclaim herself. Andrew, standing against the wall, felt his chest tighten. He had never seen such quiet strength in anyone. He watched her hands, how they moved with deliberate grace even as she stood still. He sensed something extraordinary just beneath the surface, something his father was too blind to recognize. The cruelty of the moment weighed heavily on him, but so did the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this woman would defy every expectation. As the orchestra readied their instruments again, the murmurs grew louder, speculation rippling through the crowd. "She'll stumble in seconds," one man chuckled. "She doesn't belong here," another muttered. Yet Samuel, standing at the edge of the room, whispered to himself, almost reverently, "They have no idea who they're about to witness." Elena closed her eyes, drawing a slow breath. Beneath the jeers and the smirks, she heard something else. The distant echo of applause, the rhythm of a waltz that once defined her, the call of a destiny that had refused to die. And when she opened her eyes again, there was no maid, no servant, no forgotten dancer. There was only Elena Rivers, and she was ready to remind the world what it had lost. The music began softly, and Margaret Whitmore glided to the center of the polished floor, her gown shimmering under the chandeliers. The audience clapped politely as she raised her chin and offered a theatrical smile, already certain of her victory. Every gesture was designed to flaunt her refinement, the sweep of her arms, the calculated bends of her knees. But her movements were stiff, rehearsed, the product of expensive lessons rather than true passion. She twirled with practiced grace, careful not to wrinkle her dress. And each time she passed Richard, he applauded louder than anyone else, his arrogance filling the room like a foul perfume. The crowd laughed along, pleased to indulge in the charade. But Elena watched from the corner with the stillness of a predator waiting to strike. To anyone else, she looked calm, detached even, but inside her body hummed with restrained energy, her muscles tightening in silent rehearsal. She saw through Margaret's act instantly. Every step, every spin was the movement of a hobbyist, not an artist. The difference was night and day, and though the crowd cheered, Elena knew their applause was hollow, built on status rather than skill. Samuel Hayes observed carefully from his post near the wall, recognizing the subtle stretches Elena had begun to make. They were the same warm-ups she had once performed before stepping onto the grandest stages in the world. He whispered to himself, "They have no idea." As Margaret finished with an exaggerated bow, the room clapped in a polite approval, more out of loyalty to her wealth than admiration for her art. Richard kissed her hand, announcing with a grin, "Flawless as always, my dear. Now let us see if our guest can manage even a single step without collapsing." The guests laughed again, but their amusement wavered as Elena began her slow walk to the center of the floor. She carried no gown, no jewels, no painted mask of confidence. Yet something about her presence made the room grow colder, heavier, as if the air itself anticipated what was about to happen. She paused in the middle, smoothed her apron with a dignity that startled some, and looked directly at the orchestra. "The same waltz," she said simply. Richard chuckled, raising his glass. "Oh, how sweet. She wants a second chance. Play it again, then. Let's see how long she lasts before she begs for mercy." The violins began once more, the first bars filling the air with a melody both delicate and commanding. Elena closed her eyes, and for a heartbeat she was no longer in the ballroom. She was back on the stage of the National Theater, her body whole, her spirit alight. The roar of applause echoed in her memory, and with it came the strength she had thought was lost forever. She opened her eyes and stepped forward. At first her movements were gentle, almost hesitant, as if she wanted the audience to believe their expectations were correct. But then came the turn of her wrist, the sweep of her leg, the arc of her body bending with such grace that the musicians themselves faltered. A ripple spread through the crowd. This was no maid fumbling through steps. This was something else, something dangerous to the pride of every person who had mocked her. Each beat of the waltz carried her higher, stronger, until her turns became fluid arcs, her leaps delicate yet commanding, her control absolute. Richard's smirk faded, Margaret's hands tightened on her gown, and Andrew's eyes widened with awe. He saw not a servant, but a woman reclaiming her birthright before their very eyes. The whispers began. "Who is she? How can she move like that? This is extraordinary." And then silence, pure, reverent silence as Elena rose into a sequence so intricate, so powerful that even seasoned patrons of the arts could not comprehend what they were witnessing. She had become the music itself, bending time and space with every motion. It was not a performance. It was a resurrection. When the final note soared and Elena froze in her finishing pose, arms outstretched, head lifted in dignity, the silence lingered, stunned and absolute. Then came a single clap, then another, and within seconds the entire hall was on its feet. Applause crashing like thunder, shouts of "Bravo" and "Magnificent" echoing off the marble walls. Elena Rivers had not just danced. She had shattered the illusion of superiority, exposing the cruelty of the powerful with nothing but grace. The applause rolled across the ballroom like a storm breaking, wave after wave of hands clapping until the chandeliers trembled and the marble floor seemed to pulse beneath their feet. Guests who moments earlier had sneered at Elena now stood with shining eyes, some whispering in disbelief, others clapping until their palms turned red. The sound was not polite this time. It was reverent, urgent, the sound reserved for moments when human artistry transcends every barrier. Margaret stood frozen, her face drained of its haughty composure, her jeweled fingers trembling against her gown. Richard, pale as a ghost, could not bring himself to look at the woman he had mocked only minutes ago. His smirk was gone, replaced by an expression caught between confusion and fear, as if he had just glimpsed something larger than his power, larger than his wealth. Elena, still in her final pose, breathed evenly, her eyes lifted, her dignity unshaken despite the storm around her. She did not smile or bow. She stood as if daring the world to remember who she was. And then, from the edge of the room, Samuel Hayes stepped forward, his voice steady, carrying the weight of truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, raising his hand for silence, "allow me to reintroduce to you someone you all thought lost. This is Elena Rivers, once the principal soloist of the American National Ballet." The room gasped collectively, sharp intakes of breath punctuating the revelation. Some clasped their pearls in shock. Others muttered names they had not spoken in years. "Impossible," one patron of the arts whispered. "She died. The papers said." "The papers said many things," Samuel replied firmly, "but none of them erased the truth standing before you tonight." Elena's eyes softened briefly at his words, gratitude flickering in her gaze. Whispers rippled through the crowd, memories of past performances, of glowing reviews, of the tragic accident that had ended her career. The weight of recognition settled over the hall, and suddenly the maid they had mocked was no longer invisible. She was a legend reborn before their eyes. Andrew, who had remained silent in agony throughout his father's cruelty, stepped forward now with resolve. His voice shook, but his conviction was clear. "Miss Rivers," he said, loud enough for all to hear, "I want to apologize on behalf of my family. What was done to you tonight was unforgivable." The words hung heavy, cutting through the air like a blade. The crowd turned toward him, stunned by the son's defiance of his father. Richard's face flushed crimson, his control slipping further. "Jonathan," he began, but his voice cracked, betraying his panic. Andrew ignored him. "You are owed respect, not humiliation," he continued. "What you have given us tonight is not entertainment, but grace, and I, for one, am honored to have witnessed it." Murmurs of agreement spread quickly, small nods, soft claps, until the sentiment of the room tilted against Richard entirely. No longer were the guests entertained by his cruelty. They were repulsed by it. For the first time in years, he was not the master of the evening, but the fool who had invited his own ruin. Richard tried to laugh, to dismiss it as a joke gone too far, but the laughter died in his throat when he saw the looks in their eyes. They were not amused. They were judging him, condemning him silently for the arrogance he had paraded so carelessly. Margaret reached for his arm, but even she could not mask her discomfort, her pride wounded by the undeniable truth that her dance had been eclipsed utterly by the woman she had scorned. Elena finally lowered her arms and spoke, her voice calm, resonant, steady as stone. "You wanted me to dance, Mr. Whitmore, and I have. But what you did tonight was not a game. It was cruelty, and every person here knows it." A hush fell again, the kind of silence that cuts deeper than words. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The humiliation was complete, carved into him by the dignity of the woman he had tried to destroy. And as the applause rose once more, it was no longer for the dance alone, but for the justice of truth revealed at last. The tension inside the ballroom thickened like smoke, choking Richard as 200 eyes bore into him, waiting for him to keep the very promise he had made in arrogance. His face flushed, his lips twitched, but before he could spin another excuse, Samuel Hayes stepped forward again, his phone raised high, the screen glowing in the low light. "Before anyone doubts what was said tonight," Samuel declared, "perhaps it would be wise for you all to hear the truth exactly as it happened." With a steady hand, he pressed the play, and Richard's own voice boomed across the hall, captured with devastating clarity. "If she can dance better than my wife, I'll marry my son to her on the spot, and if she fails, she'll crawl on her knees and clean this hall." Gasps broke out across the room, followed by murmurs of disbelief. There was no denying it, no rewriting the scene. Richard's arrogance had trapped him in his own words. He lunged towards Samuel, snarling, "That's illegal! That's blackmail!" But Samuel didn't flinch. His voice remained calm, almost weary. No, Mr. Whitmore, it's accountability. 200 witnesses heard it, and now they've heard it again. You have no escape. The guests shifted uneasily, some hiding their laughter behind hands, others shaking their heads at the spectacle of a man undone by his own cruelty. Richard turned desperately toward his son. Jonathan, Andrew, say something! Stop this madness! But Andrew stepped forward, his face resolute, his voice carrying both pain and strength. Father, enough. You brought this upon yourself. This woman has shown more courage, more dignity, and more class tonight than you have in your entire life. The crowd erupted in low murmurs, nods of approval spreading like wildfire. Richard's jaw tightened, rage flashing in his eyes. If you side with her, you are no son of mine. You'll be out of this company, out of this family, out of everything I've built. His voice cracked on the last word, the desperation unmistakable. Andrew took a step closer to Eleni, his hands trembling slightly but his gaze steady. Then so be it. I would rather lose everything than stand by and watch you destroy another life for your pride. The guests, many of them seasoned opportunists, recognized the shift instantly. The power had changed hands, not with money, but with moral courage. Richard's empire was collapsing in real time, and everyone could feel it. Phones discreetly recorded the exchange, flashes of light capturing the anguish on Richard's face. Within minutes, videos began to circulate beyond the ballroom, leaping onto social media where the headlines wrote themselves. Millionaire humiliates woman and loses everything. Richard felt the walls closing in. He staggered backward, clutching at his glass for comfort, but it slipped from his shaking hand and shattered at his feet, a cruel echo of Elena's tray earlier in the evening. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. He had mocked her for a fall, and now it was he who stood broken, exposed, undone. Margaret tried to whisper comfort, but her words were drowned out by the low roar of conversation sweeping the room. Investors texted furiously, reputations dissolved in real time, and Richard knew with a bone-deep certainty that tomorrow the papers would crucify him. Andrew turned to Elena with quiet reverence. Miss Rivers, he said, you owe this man nothing, but know this, your courage tonight has changed more than this room. It's changed me. Elena's eyes softened, though her spine remained straight. She had not come here for revenge, but for dignity, and tonight dignity had triumphed. Richard stumbled toward the exit, muttering threats about lawyers, but no one followed him. The once feared titan of finance left alone, his empire crumbling behind him, and as the doors shut on his retreat, the ballroom seemed to exhale as though purged of a poison that had lingered too long. Elena stood tall in the center, her silence more powerful than any words, while Andrew and Samuel remained at her side. The fall of arrogance had been complete, and the echoes of that collapse were only just beginning to spread beyond those gilded walls. The weeks that followed became a whirlwind no one could have predicted. Richard Whitmore, once untouchable, watched his empire collapse brick by brick. Contracts vanished overnight, investors fled, and his name became synonymous with arrogance exposed. Margaret filed for divorce and slipped quietly to Europe, leaving him a hollow shadow of the man who once commanded rooms with fear. Meanwhile, Elena Rivers stepped into a light she had never sought but could no longer avoid. The viral videos of her dance spread across the globe, stirring hearts with the story of a woman underestimated and humiliated, only to rise in breathtaking triumph. Offers poured in. International ballet companies begged her to choreograph. Theaters offered residencies. Even Hollywood wanted her story. Yet Elena chose differently. She declined the glittering promises and instead used her newfound influence to open the Rivers Center for the Arts, a sanctuary for children who had talent but no means. In a sunlit studio, she taught barefoot dancers whose laughter filled the space with hope. Samuel Hayes became her steadfast supporter, proud to witness a woman reclaim her destiny with grace. And Andrew Whitmore, having severed ties with his father's toxic legacy, became the first major donor, planting gardens around the center with his own hands as a promise of renewal. On opening day, Elena stood at the front of the room, surrounded by children spinning clumsily but joyfully, her eyes glistening with quiet triumph. She whispered, Sometimes we lose everything only to discover who we were meant to be. The applause that filled the small hall that day was softer than the thunder of Manhattan's elite, but to Elena, it was more real, more human, more eternal. Richard Whitmore faded into obscurity, while Elena's legacy grew. Not in wealth, but in lives touched, and futures changed. True nobility, she had proved, is not in fortunes or pedigrees, but in how we choose to lift others when no one expects us to. And now I ask you, have you ever been underestimated, judged unfairly, or told you were less than what you knew in your heart to be true? Share your story in the comments below, because your voice, like Elena's dance, may be the spark someone else needs to believe again.